Copywriting for Artists with today's special guest, Andrea Hubbert. Today's episode is brought to you by Builderall. They are my favorite all-in-one solution for your online business. Everything you need to start your online business, from landing pages to emails to selling your first products, all without breaking the bank. Find out how Builderall can help you grow your online business at servenomaster.com/Builderall.
Are you tired of dealing with your boss? Do you feel underpaid and underappreciated? If you want to make it online, fire your boss and start living your retirement dreams now, then you've come to the right place. Welcome to Serve No Master Podcast, where you'll learn how to open new revenue streams and make money while you sleep. Presented live from a tropical island in the South Pacific by best-selling author Jonathan Green. Now, here's your host.
Now, Andrea, I'm really interested in people who specialize. I think it's so important because oftentimes when we hear copywriter, we think of something different. And everyone thinks of as writing advertising, writing commercials, writing sales letters, writing emails. And sure, different people who call themselves copywriters do all those things, but they're different specialties. And I noticed that your specialty really has to do with people who are performers, whether it's musicians, artists, podcasters. And tell me, how did you kind of dial into that as your specialty? How did your journey begin?
Oh, you know what? It's really funny because it sort of found me, to be completely honest with you. I was doing PR for a nonprofit, and I realized, even it was a larger nonprofit, so it sort of operated like a business, that I'm just not a good employee. Like the 9-to-5 thing wasn't for me. So I was trying to figure out, what did I want to do? And I had it in my mind that I wanted to work with musicians. That's what I started with. And I was researching, and, you know, when you have no experience in the business and you have no context in the business, you go to Barnes & Noble back in the day. So that's what I did. I was in Barnes & Noble. I met the manager of the music department. She took me to an organization where there were a lot of musicians, a networking organization. And that's how I literally fell into working with musicians. And then it ballooned from there to all creatives.
So a lot of creative people think, hey, my art speaks for itself. My music speaks for itself. And I know this, as was in the music industry myself for a really long time. A lot of artists have very specific ideas about their vision. Like they only want to work with certain record companies, not other record companies. And I've seen same thing with authors. You know, I know authors who are like, I'll only traditionally publish, and their book has been sitting in a drawer for 10 years. And they would never self-publish. They'd rather nobody read it than it not go out to traditional publishers. So sometimes you'll have these like really firm ideas of their process. So how do kind of musicians and other creative people start to realize that copywriting can make a difference? Like how a good versus a bad tour poster, or a good versus a bad radio appearance can make a difference in what happens, especially for bands that are on the way up.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have to remind people, my clients in particular, that it really is about building fans for life. So I focus on helping them to find the words that are going to create that environment where, whether it's the existing people who are in their ecosphere or other people that they're trying to bring in, can see the connection points, right? Because it's not just about your music. Your music, of course, has to be great, for sure. But it's also about, you know, what's behind the music? What influenced the music? Who are you as a person? What quirks and idiosyncrasies do you have? Because I potentially have the same ones, and that's going to be of interest to me as part of an audience. So I focus a lot on finding and using the right words that help people to see you as more than just your music. Because as a performer, you are more than just your music. As an author, you are more than just your books. As whomever, you are more than just the product that you create.
I'm used to, in some genres of music, like the story seems really important. Like every single rapper and hip hop artist shares their background. I'm much more aware of that than in other genres, like how many times someone's been shot or done crime. Whereas you look at a genre like outlaw country, where those guys were going to jail like crazy, even like some really big musicians would go to jail for murder and all sorts of stuff. and it was kind of like secondary, if that makes sense. Like they did the music and then the story was happening, but almost you didn't hear about it as often. Even big artists like Johnny Paycheck, who shot someone over turtle soup, which is like crazy to think about. He's like, why would you think I want turtle soup, and shot a guy in a bar, right? And I only heard that story 30 years later. And so sometimes is it different genres, or is it that a mistake for these other genres not to put their story first, and they should pay more attention to how effective a good story can be for these other artists, and how they should start following what's happening in these other genres, because it does make a big difference?
I think it is a mistake not to put your story first, but I also think that unless you're really paying attention, not unless, when you really pay attention, you do hear parts of the story. It might not be as much as, what you're talking about, somebody shooting somebody, and it very overt. It might not be as overt as that, but you are hearing people's stories. You're hearing people talking about mental health when they're talking about how, sad they are, upset, depressed, whatever. You're hearing people talking about how they like alternative lifestyle. And I mean like goth, for instance, as an alternative lifestyle, although it's not as alternative anymore. But you're hearing that when people are talking to you, and you're seeing their promotional materials, and you see the attire, and you know that it's authentic, I think, when it's not as overt, when it's naturally part of the lyric or part of the post that they're making. Because honestly, sometimes when people are so out there, you wonder, is it actually true or not, right? Is it just to help get the crowd going, or did those things really happen?
Yeah, I notice a lot, like when you watch these television shows where there's 10 singers competing, all 10 are underdogs. They all have a story, and it's like there's no favorite. Somehow they have competitions. That's what they've really figured out, is that no matter who you're following, you're rooting for the underdog. Every single person is the underdog. And sometimes it seems like there's certain types of stories that are more effective. Like if you come from like a normal family and you went to school and worked really hard, and then you went to music school and now you're a musician, that's like the story nobody wants to hear, right? What they really want to hear is a story of where like you stole your first guitar and you learned to play under railroad tracks. And there are plenty of people that's their story, but that's not everyone's story. So I feel like sometimes people think their story is too boring, and that's when they create this other type of narrative. And I've also sometimes, I think what you're saying is that I remember my sister really liked this band OAR, and it sounded like a jam band. And I was like, oh yeah, I've been to Widespread Panic concerts. My roommate in college was really into Fish. So I'm familiar with that style of music and all that. And then I went to one of their concerts, and they were all dressed in like khaki pants and polo shirts. And I was like, what's going on here? These guys are not dressed like their music sounds at all. And it really threw me off, because it just wasn't what I was expecting. And I do think that, sometimes that incongruity can throw things off. So what do you think about that, to where how early in a band's journey do they have to start creating the story? And what do they do if they don't have enough adversity in their story? If they just have like a normal, or maybe just like a happy childhood?
Yeah, I think that I'm not a fan of creating the story. Sure, you can add elements, and you can, maybe add a couple of embellishments if it's going to help with the art form, but I don't think we should create stories. It's just like your example that you gave right there, your stage persona versus your online persona, like through social media or your website, versus the lyrics that you're writing. Versus the copy that you're writing, they should all tie together. People should not be surprised when they show up at a show and see that you're wearing khaki pants and polo shirts, and I thought that you were going to be, like the jam band Fish or something, right? Because now you've lost my trust. You probably won't ever get it back. I'm probably going to tell other people about that. Now you've lost those potential audience members as well. For what? To sell an extra record or two? People want to know who you are. They want to understand why you're writing the music that you write. Even if your childhood was great, right? There's still something that you can connect with somebody else on. People like to feel connected, and they like to cheer you on. especially if they consider themselves a fan, they want to feel like they're helping to contribute to the larger community, which is the success that you're having as an artist or an author or a podcaster or whomever.
So can someone have a
So
story
I guess
that's like positive?
I was just going to say, so I guess if you don't have that story from your childhood, you've certainly got it now, because there's nobody who can snap their fingers and all of a sudden be, a superstar performer. So you've got something in your story right now that you could be talking about.
I sometimes see these performers where they're very heavy on the costuming, whether it's a band like Slipknot where they wear all those scary costumes, or like Deadmau5 who always wears a giant mouse hat, which has got to be hot inside of there. So
Yeah.
you end up, or even Daft Punk, who kind of originated the helmet thing. Like you never see them outside the helmets. Sometimes it seems like artists paint themselves into a corner where they create this story that the story becomes bigger than them. I think more people are familiar with the Daft Punk helmets than with their music. So
yes, for sure.
And I wonder how early on you can start wearing the helmet. Like when you're just playing music for 10 people, it seems like it's too soon. But I wonder kind of if that part of the story seems to get really, really strong, and where that comes from. Is that kind of like another way to create the narrative? Because there's, almost all the bands that do that end up getting really well known for it.
Exactly. Well, and I think that all of those bands that did that were doing it at a time when two things were happening. You had to almost have some sort of a gimmick to get seen. You had to be seen. And most times it was because they were trying to be seen by label. They wanted something bigger than the groundswell that they were potentially already building on their own. And those two things lead you to do things that you might not necessarily do if that wasn't the case. I wonder, honestly, I really do. I wonder if Daft Punk and if Slipknot and if, I forgot your other example, or anybody who's made gimmicks out of their persona would do that now. If they were starting now, I venture to say probably not all of them would.
Yeah. So do you think that nowadays you don't really need a label as much as you used to? You can have a lot more direct communication with your audience.
Yep.
So for someone who's starting out, or somebody who's in a position trying to figure things out, how do they start to figure out and stick with their story? It's kind of like, I'm really interested in when people break the rules. Like I grew up listening to Hootie and the Blowfish, and then he decided, and he started to become like a country guy. And so he completely switched genres. And I remember, his story is interesting. Everyone said it will never work. And then of course his album's #1. He's winning all the awards because he's crushing country. And it's so unexpected. And I think for me, the unexpected part is like, you switch stories. It's very, very hard to switch genres. Like to switch.
But did he really switch his story, or did he figure out a different way to tell it?
Now I don't know.
I would say,
good question. Now I don't know. You got me good there.
I would say, yeah, go ahead.
Because he definitely, he sounds the same. It's the same voice. He didn't switch stories. He did switch genres, and I think, but maybe you're right. Maybe the story's not that different. And I think that's just something that's really interesting, because I haven't thought of it that way. But I know that, very interested. It was a hard transition because everyone said, you can't do it. Why are you singing country music? He's like, I've always loved country music. I thought that was really interesting.
I think that when people have success in multiple different genres in music's instance, or even publishing, it's because they figure out a different way to tell the story. They figure out how to appeal to the audience that they're trying to attract, which in my mind is the most important thing. That is the number one thing that I work with my clients on, is who are we trying to reach and what is going to be the most appealing to them. And that's how you figure out the way to tell your story.
So there's a lot of manufactured bands. I remember I was at a music school in England about 12, 14 years ago, and they were looking for bands, and you had to be like 14 because they want to get them really early, so they can have a long career arc. Once you're 20, it's like already too late, So, and you see bands that are kind of formed where it's like a boy band or a girl band, especially, right? Where they bring 4 guys or 5 girls together, and they start off with running ads, and it's a manufactured band. And then almost everything is created. These bands, they do really well. right? Like BTS is not a bunch of guys that grew up and became friends together. Like they were assembled just like most of those types of bands are, and they do so well. Do you think that's because the story is created and then they find people to fit into the story? Like it seems like every one of these group singing bands, they have the good looking guy, the fat guy, the silly one. Like they kind of have the roles to fall into. So everyone kind of relates to one of them so they can have a different favorite.
I think that the reason that they do look for them so young is because they can impress that story upon them. Because if you think about it, think about all of those manufactured bands and what's happened to them. They all fall apart because they can't sustain it, because it's not true to them. And then you hear things about them and you're like, oh, I never would have suspected that, or I never would have known, it's because it wasn't theirs to begin with.
Yeah, that's interesting. It does seem to work for like a while. Maybe it's 4 or 5 years. And then I remember I heard an interview from someone who's like, I'm the bad boy from the Backstreet Boys. And I was like, are you?
Yeah. Right.
It's like, I never thought that one of them was the bad boy. Like, you don't think of that because they're all singing like these happy songs, usually put together by amazing producers and all of those things. But the story seems to work, and it's always the same story, isn't it? It's the same, at least my whole life, even from the early 80s with New Kids on the Block, it's the same as One Direction. It's the same kind of story that just keeps working. But you're right, it doesn't last very long.
It's a formula.
They break it up. Yeah. So how can an individual kind of dial into a formula that works? Like, why do some small bands, because there's so many amazing bands no one's ever heard of. Like my favorite musician has like 1,300 followers on SoundCloud, and I probably listen to her song 40 times a week.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I'm like, golly, am I the only fan?
Right.
And I listen to it over and over again. I'm following her on and I don't follow musicians very much anymore. I'm over 40. You don't really learn new music at a certain age, right?
Right.
But how can someone separate? Because so many people, the music's not enough. Like you want it to be, but no one ever catches you. Like most really big bands, there's that story about the one person who saw them and made them big. Like there was the guy who saw Elvis, right? The Colonel or whatever, and then made him big. Or there's the record executive who does it, or there's a band who like the DJ K-Rock kept playing their song over and over again until they liked it. Or like Hootie and the Blowfish became big because some late night TV show guy, I think, couldn't stop saying, he thought the name of the band was so funny that he would say the name of the band every single episode. He said it like 150 episodes in a row. And it's like, that made you don't plan that. How can you plan? And it's because their name was silly. And he's like, and I remember he was like, I didn't think people would call me Hootie. And it's like, no, any band with "and," you always think the first person's the singer. He's like, I didn't know everyone would start calling me Hootie. If I could go back, I wouldn't have done that. But your story, sometimes you can't predict the thing that hits for you. So what are some things that musicians or artists can do to increase the odds of their story hitting?
I think you've said one thing already, and that is stop trying to attract the millions and try and attract the one. And I know that sounds trite, but I'm telling you, once you make a connection with one person, the next person, then of course it gets exponentially more people. But once you make that connection with them, now you're building real fans for life. You can fall into a formula, right? We all know that part of the formula is that you record good music, you go on the road, you spend your time, really honing your stage presence. Then you maybe do some showcases, you try and get like the formula and you play into the formula. But I would say don't let the formula control you. You have to control the formula. And that starts by looking for the real authentic people that you can make a connection with, because that's what's going to help build that buzz. Excuse me. It's just like in the example that you gave, right? It wasn't a connection with the TV guy. Maybe he was just making fun, but the DJ, right? When DJs were able to pick their own music, they weren't going to play stuff that either didn't have commercial appeal already or that didn't connect with them somehow that they then wanted to share with other people. So I think it really is about don't try and go too big too fast, because that's when you lose yourself.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's the right person, because that story about, I think it was David Letterman. He was driving home from work one day and he heard the Hootie and the Blowfish song on the road, pulled over and was like, who is this band? I got to have them on my show. And he became obsessed. And it's only because some DJ was randomly playing the song that they wasn't supposed to play it that day.
Yeah.
And you're right that it is, if you get the right person, then they'll tell their friends and they'll tell their friends. And sometimes it's the right DJ and the right person's listening, and it can be this crazy story. But yeah, sometimes these bands, and it's the same thing in a lot of markets. Whenever I work with an author and I go, who's this book for? And they go, everyone. And I go, that's not going to work.
Right.
It's the same people reading biographies, aren't reading poetry, aren't reading romance novels. But sometimes in marketing, people want everyone. And they think of these bands, they say, oh, everyone likes them. But if you look at like the most successful albums, they sell what? Not anymore, but like 20 million albums is like a crazy high number. That's like not even 10% of the population of America. And that's worldwide. Like that's not even 1% of the worldwide population. But sometimes people want everyone, but no one's ever had everyone like them. Like for every band that tons of people love, there are people that hate them.
Right.
So when you first meet a new band and you're sitting down with them and saying, okay, here's my process for figuring out which part of your story to put forward first, what are some of the first questions you ask them?
So I do ask one of the very first questions is, who are you people? Like, who's your ride or die? Because that's who we want to craft your story around. I'm not saying that, your story is marketable right out of the gate. Of course, you have to do some crafting of it. But when we craft a story, when we massage a story, we're doing it for a reason. And usually it is because we know who is going to fall in love with that story, who's going to be our ride or dies. So that is one of the very first questions I ask, who's your ride or die? Then I always ask, now, what are the most important or interesting, probably interesting is a better way to say it, what are the most interesting things that have happened to you that you have shared in your music or that you have shared online? Because if it's been interesting to you and you haven't shared it, then you really don't know if it's going to be interesting to anybody else, right? And if you're not writing about it, then you're not attracting the people who are going to find that interesting. I know that I've been saying this a lot, but I'm telling you, it is the most important thing, is making sure you're dialed in on the right person or people. Because you could say, I want to attract, middle-aged women who are soccer moms, and my music is all about, how much I dislike women. I mean, that's an extreme example, but sorry, buddy, but you're never going to attract them then.
What do you do when they tell you a bad story and you're like, this is a story that will repel your audience or it won't work? Because sometimes what we think is interesting is not what our audience think is interesting. And this is what I've had to learn over my career. Some of my favorite stories, I'm like, my favorite book that I've written, my audience hates. Like, it's their least favorite. And I think this happens to a lot of bands too. They say, this is my favorite song, and their audience hates it. It just happens a lot creatively, right? What people like to create is not what people like to listen to.
Right.
In the same way that some musicians for a while go, I don't play that song anymore because I got so tired of it, right? It's like, no, that's the song everyone loves you for, right? And it can be, you're like a victim of your own success. But what do you do when you say, oh, tell me some of your stories? And I'll give you an example for me. One of my clients in a book, he goes, I really want to include this story about how I left my fiance at the altar. And I said, everyone's going to hate you. There's no woman or man who hears that story and thinks the person who leaves the other person at the altar is the hero. That's the villain, right? That's the start of the story where then the person turns out to be the villain that the hero kills. That's not the hero story. And that was like a big conflict. He's like, no, I love that story. And I was like, yeah, but everyone will hate you. So sometimes we have these stories that are part of who we are. And I understand it. And maybe it was the right decision for him. Probably could have made the decision a little earlier. But sometimes people want the story that they think matters is either boring or worse, and has a negative impact on their audience.
Mm-hmm. I think that I agree with your assessment of that story in particular. However, if there's a way to turn it, to end it with some sort of, maybe there was a lesson, maybe something positive, right? Then you could maybe use it as a kernel in an interview because it was inspiration for a song. Or you could use it as a social post when you're promoting that, if that's a new song or something like that. Hey, this was inspired from the time that I left my fiance at the altar. I learned these things and I wrote this song about it. Okay. But to just say, that you love somebody at the altar and leave it at that, no, that's not going to work. So again, you really need that really comes back to you need to know who they are, who your people are, to know how to turn something like that into something positive.
Yeah, because there's so many songs about things like there's so many songs about I'm in love with my friend's wife or my friend's girlfriend. Like all these songs from the 70s and 80s. I wish I had Jesse's girl. It's like I
Yeah.
don't think Jesse likes that song at all.
No.
It's like, why is this man singing about my girlfriend? And there's some really famous songs. I watch a lot of rock and roll documentaries lately about all these. You don't realize what they're about. And this is a song about a guy who tried to hit on his teacher's wife at a college party. And that's another famous song I was listening to the other day. I was like, oh, wow. And that's a Steely Dan song. And so there's.
Which one is that?
Gosh.
I love Steely Dan.
Yeah. One of their songs is about him at college hitting on the professor's wife. And it was it's crazy. I forget which one it was. I watched that documentary 2 days ago, but it's really amazing. You never think of that, right? You don't realize. We often listen to a song and don't realize what it's about. So
yeah,
sometimes we just like the words, especially if it's really happy, if the words are negative, we sometimes miss it. There's all these stories. Oh, that's what the song's really about. And it's is it, I wonder that, does the song still belong to the artist? If you think it means one thing and 10 million people think it means something else, does the meaning change?
Yes, I think it does. I think it's whatever. It's just like your brand, your inanimate brand. It's whatever the audience thinks. It's the perspective that they have. Yes, you can try and influence it. And maybe if you told the story sooner, they would have understood the lyrics, but you didn't. This is what they understand it to be now. And it's sort of out of your hands at that point.
Yeah, because sometimes those songs, I never watched those videos. I'm like, no, I think the song is about what I think it's about, or what it means to that person. That's the thing about art. Sometimes people read my books and they get a completely different message. And that's okay, because I think of books, it's a democracy, right? Readers get to vote whether or not they want to read the book or buy the book and listen to the music and share the music. There's so much power in the listener because they can tell their friends or not tell their friends. They can buy another album or not buy another album. If they don't like it, they don't like it. And I do see sometimes artists, when they get so obsessed with the original version, right? They get stuck. And then there's artists who kind of lean into it. There's a couple of Pearl Jam songs that people completely misinterpreted. And there's a really interesting interview with Eddie Vedder where he goes, yeah, the song doesn't mean what I thought it meant anymore. He goes, the audience changed the meaning of the song for me. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Because he said a couple of songs, he's like, sometimes the record label convinces them to put the song out. They don't like it. And then it becomes number one. It's their least favorite song. No, that was a personal song. It wasn't for everyone. And then you're like, uh-oh. And it becomes this really powerful song for a lot of people. And I thought that was really interesting because some artists are open to that. And I think that can really make a difference. Just realizing that your story, it's not often what you say, it's what people hear that can become really important. There's definitely songs where I've completely misheard the words. And the version I originally heard was way better than the version that they actually said. And I was like, oh man, you guys got to fix this to what I thought you said. So this has been really interesting and really helpful. And it's really interesting to think of kind of copywriting in this area of creativity for painters and artists and podcasters and how important it can be to create your story. Where can people learn more about what you're doing, see more about how you're helping artists, and maybe even see if you're the right fit to work with you? Sure.
Before that, I want to just touch on what you said about Pearl Jam, about Eddie Vedder and the label. Sometimes that's exactly the thing you want to happen, even though you might not appreciate it at the time, which is the thing that you didn't think was going to take off, or the thing that you didn't want to do is the thing that ends up being the biggest. It's because probably subconsciously it has the most connection. And if we can just think about doing that more, consciously, more intentionally, then we're going to have more connection points, which is going to help us build those fans for life, which is what I'm all about. So my website is hubandcompany.com. So that would be the best place to find me and to find out more about me and how I can potentially help.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as I do. Copywriting is a passion of mine, and getting started doesn't have to cost a penny. I've put together a collection of some of the greatest ads of all time and some exercises to get you started. You can get my ultimate swipe file right now at surfmaster.com/ultimate.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Serve No Master podcast. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss another episode. We'll be back next week with more tips and tactics on how to escape the rat race. Please take a moment to leave a review at servenomaster.com/iTunes. It helps the show grow, and more listeners means more content for you. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.